Today I'm here to talk about React-based content management, about our open source project called Netlify CMS. As Brian mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Netlify. Netlify is a platform that automates the whole workflow around working with modern front-end web projects. So we hook into your Git hosting provider, and whenever you push to Git, we'll run your front-end build tool. We'll do an atomic deploy to our own content delivery network. We'll build branch deploys and pull requests and give you unlimited staging environments. We'll deploy your Lambda functions and much, much more. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Today I'm going to talk about content management. I have a background where I worked as CTO for a company in Spain that built websites for small to medium businesses. And we were building like 100 websites a week, tens of thousands of websites in total. We built our own in-house content management system. It had a couple of generations of those. Then I started a CMS company called WebPop that built like a cloud-hosted content management system. So I've had a lot of experience with working with this kind of traditional monolithic content management system. It's the systems like WordPress or Drupal or any of those that we've been using for the last 15 years or so to build websites with. Typically, their architecture looks something like this, where you have all the content lives in some database, where you have your post, your users, your comments, settings, all of that. If there is some kind of version control for the content, it's typically complex systems built inside the database that don't always work very well. The whole CMS is a big monolithic instance that bundles together the admin UI that content editors will use to come in and update that database, together with the rendering engine that every visitor will interact with when they go to a website powered by the CMS, and have this whole trigger of a program that talks to a database that then hooks into a template engine and a bunch of plugins and ends up spitting out a bunch of HTML that's sent back to the user. Now, this is like an architecture that's been around for a long time to solve the problem of like how do we actually have people work on content, have an easy way to build sites, but it's also an architecture that's been getting more and more problematic as time goes by, right? We've seen more and more security issues from actually running this kind of database-driven code on every request. Performance is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, also as mobile devices becomes more popular and people get way less patient when they can't actually multitask while we're viewing your site. And scalability has become more and more of an issue in terms of like actual handling today's like web scale traffic when a campaign suddenly goes viral or a site becomes really popular, or you just get featured on Hacker News or the like. So we've started to see like this model being chopped into different pieces essentially. And one of those pieces have been like the rise of static site generators. Started being really popularized by Jekyll and GitHub Pages, and now there's like a huge wealth of static site generators like Gatsby, Hugo, and so on. I'll talk more about those. But basically, the idea with a static site generator is that we take the content and we typically treat that as just like flat files in some structured format. It's really common to have Markdown with some metadata in the front matter, or YAML or JSON files. Then we have our templates. And then we have a generator that takes that content, that takes those templates, and then spits out a static front end that we can then push to a CDN or put anywhere without like, and really decouple like the build stage of our site from the actual runtime of our site. We built a directory, an open source directory called staticgen.com, where we list all the open source static site generators out there, and where you can see the traction they have and to get easy deploy options for some of them. One of the interesting ones from for the perspective of this conference is Gatsby. That's probably the fastest growing static site generator right now. Gatsby is a static site generator built in React. So the idea with Gatsby is really to take this whole ecosystem that's been built for building front-end applications and make it available for building content-driven websites. So instead of using a template language like Liquid or Mustache or anything like that, you use React components as your template language. And then Gatsby has a GraphQL layer, so you can make all the content, whether it lives as flat files or whether it lives in an API somewhere or in an external system. You can make it available through your template simply by writing simple GraphQL queries, hooking them up to your components, and then running this build that will spit out a static front end that will then, when it loads in the browser, be rehydrated with the React components and work essentially as a single page app that will lazy load the pages as you go along and give you incredibly good performance out of the box. And we've sort of started to see, based on that, this concept of CI/CD for content-driven sites, right? Where we started seeing like the continuous deployment model way back for like our big back-end applications and so on. Now we're seeing that applied together with these static site generators as a way where you simply say, okay, you have your local developer environment. And the beauty of static site generators is typically that since there's no database and things like that, you can just clone a repository, you can run a local dev server with live previews and so on. You get a very, very good local development experience. And then every time you push to Git, you have something pick up that push, run a build, and push the deploy to a CDN. So you get this kind of like automated workflow where any developer can contribute, and whenever there's a new push, you get a new version of the site. That's great for developers. And we've often seen like development teams become extremely excited about this prospect of just working with flat files in GitHub and having a great local development environment. And then they go to their marketing department and tell them like, we can do everything in GitHub as flat files and so on. And it's really rare that the marketing department meets that with the same level of excitement. Typically, it'll more be a question of like, yeah, but where's my CMS, right? So that leaves the question, what do you do with content management with this kind of setup? And that's where the concept of headless CMSs has started to emerge. We run another directory called headlesscms.org where you can follow both the proprietary, the API-based, the Git-based, and so on. Encourage you to visit there. Basically, the idea of a headless CMS is that where we had that big monolith that included like the admin UI, the site building, the content database, and everything, we split the site building into its own concern, handled by a static site generator. And then we split the admin UI into its own concern, handled by a headless CMS that doesn't care about what you do with the content. It just cares about giving content managers, content editors, an intuitive way to manage and work with that content. And there's essentially right now two classes of headless CMSs. There's the API-based content management systems. These are systems like Contentful or Prismic or Data CMS or Graph CMS. Here the idea is that we keep the content database that we had in our monolithic system, but we pull it out of like the monolithic blob. And then we have a pure content API that you can interact with from your static site generator or sometimes even from client side. And then an admin UI that just interacts with that content and gives content editors a way to work with it. This can be really powerful when you're working with multi-channel content. So if you have content that you're going to use both for building a website and for powering an iPhone app and for having a kiosk running or whatever, that can be a really powerful approach. But at the same time, it keeps sort of the same like it keeps some of the problems of like now you again have like version control implemented in a database for your content with all the complexities of that. So there's another set of Git-based content management systems, and the one I'm going to talk about here is Netlify CMS. Pros.io was one of the first of these kinds. Code for America built one as well. There's a couple of proprietary ones like Cloud Canon and Forestry that also works with this concept. But here the concept is that we again skip the database, just work with structured data stored in a Git repository. And then we build an admin UI on top of that that gives content editors a normal content management UI for working with that content directly in the Git repository. So you get this kind of workflow where developers work locally, they push to Git. Content editors work in a web UI, they essentially push to Git without knowing it. And then you have some continuous integration system that will pick up any change in the GitHub repository and publish the new version to, preferably to a content delivery network, so it's distributed all over the world. So this becomes an architecture sort of like this for modern websites, where you have a browser that typically loads a static front end directly from a CDN. If you're using something like Gatsby, that static front end will both have all your content built out as individual pages, but as soon as you load a page, it will also hydrate the React components on that page and make them interactive React components. So every following page change just happens as if it was a single page application with the same performance boost, right? And then typically, a lot of the ecosystem that, again, inside this big monolithic application used to live as like WordPress plugins or Drupal plugins or whatever, gets replaced by a whole ecosystem of microservices. Services like Algolia for search, or Auth0 for authentication, or Stripe for payments, and often some serverless functions just to glue these together, right? But it becomes an architecture where you really have like the static front end talking to dynamic microservices, and where you decouple completely the build stage of your site from the actual runtime of the site, which just becomes a CDN. And in this context, a tool like Netlify CMS can then sit as the admin UI for content editors that lets them interact with this process. So Netlify CMS is actually a single page app built in React. It runs directly in the browser and talks straight from the browser to different backends. So right now the main backend is a GitHub backend, and you can it can either talk directly to GitHub, or it can talk through a little open source service called Git Gateway that lets you restrict access to GitHub's API based on JSON Web Token. So you can use it together with an authentication system that's not GitHub, because most of the time when you build these kind of projects, you don't want to require all the content editors to be GitHub users and even know that GitHub exists, right? We have pull requests right now with implementing GitLab and Bitbucket backends, and they should go live fairly soon. And the CMS is built with this like abstraction layer around a backend. So there's like the same UI, and you can ideally combine different backends, and there's a file-based backend as well, for example, for just working directly with your files locally. And there's some more contributions in the work there. The CMS gives editors a content editing UI for any structured data, basically. So it's a very flexible system, and I'll show in a bit like how to actually configure this. But the idea is that one of the advantages with getting away from a database system, when I built like Webpop as a multi-tenant hosted CMS, I had to spend so much time thinking about like what kind of data structures could I actually allow people to use, because it had to be like these data structures had to interact in a relational system at runtime, right? So it was really, really easy to allow people to make incredibly bad database queries and take down the whole CMS. As soon as you have this kind of split, you don't really care that much, right? Like a data structure is just like a document that's stored in Git, and it can be a very arbitrarily complex document, and you don't really care like what the static site generator does with that. So you actually get out of the box a really complex content model that can be customized a lot. The CMS is really React-based, so it's also extensible through React components in the sense that every input control that an editor uses is a little React component, and you can write new input controls just by specifying a React component and registering it with the CMS. And one of the things we did was build a system for generating a live preview of the content in the browser, because of course, when you have this publishing setup, there'll always be some lag from when you hit save till a new version of the site is actually live, because you have to have some build tools that run it, and you have to have a deploy stage and so on. So to get around that and make the editing experience really smooth for editors, we have the concept of an in-browser preview, again, based on React preview components that you can customize for your site. And that gives the experience of like actual real-time, seeing exactly what happens, often faster than many traditional CMSs that still can take quite a while from your save till you actually preview something on the site, especially if they have caching enabled and so on, right? The last step is a concept of an editorial workflow, simply hooking in and saying, okay, as developers, how do we do editorial workflow? Well, we use pull requests and branches and merges, right? So let's make that same workflow available to our content editors and make sure that like a new post goes into a pull request, you can keep working on it there, and then once you publish it, it gets merged into master. So let's see. Here we go. Okay, so netlifycms.org is the best place to get started with this. We have a couple of ready-made startup boilerplates to make it easy to set up, and they come with a one-click deploy to Netlify. It's important for me to underline that Netlify's CMS doesn't depend on Netlify as a platform. We think it's a really good idea to deploy Netlify CMS-based sites to Netlify, and that you'll get a really great experience out of it. But Netlify CMS in itself is a completely self-standing open source project, and the only requirement is that you have some kind of continuous deployment system listening to your Git repository and actually deploying your site. Otherwise, it doesn't make so much sense, right? But we don't care what site it is. We also don't care what static site generator you use. So the CMS just works with content stored in GitHub. I've cheated a little and just went ahead and created a demo site here, because setting up the initial Gatsby build always takes a little time. And if I click through here, we'll see that this is like a simple little template with an about page and a few stories. You'll notice like just the speed of Gatsby in general, because once I load the site, everything happens client side and is loaded directly from a CDN. And then if I go to this site and access/admin, this will actually load the little Netlify CMS layer. I think it's actually this mail. And I get this simple content editing UI specifically for my site. I can go in and see one of these posts with side-by-side editing. Again, right, like this is sort of a trick to make sure that the experience is really like direct in terms of seeing what you're going to get when you hit save. if I go in here and look at the underlying GitHub repository, this is a typical Gatsby site. It has a source folder with components and templates and pages. The pages is where the content actually lives in this case. So I can go in here and look in content, and if I click raw here, we can see that each blog post is this kind of markdown file with metadata in front matter. Very easy to work with in any text editor and very easy to work with locally. If I go in and look at the templates, we'll see that each template is a React component, completely standard React. And then it has a little page query in GraphQL that basically interacts, in this case, with the file system and tells the component what data should it feed to this component. And Gatsby is really powerful in this way because you can write any kind of adapter. So you can both use the file system, but Gatsby can also be used to fetching data from external APIs during the build and feed it into GraphQL and then using it with your templates. In the static folder, we have sort of the little bit of secret sauce. So the CMS depends on a config in YAML. I'll try to make this a little bigger so we can see. It has this core concept of collections, which is like the basic abstraction of the CMS. Any content you edit in the CMS will belong to some form of collection. Right now, there's two types of collection. There are collections that are folder-based, meaning that it's a folder of files that all have the same structure. And then there are collections that are file-based, meaning that they are a list of different files that can each have their own individual structure. The blog is a folder. We say that it's persisted in the blog folder here. We specify that users should be able to create new blog posts. Sometimes you want a list that has a specific element, so you don't want to be able to delete or anything. We specify the format that the files should have when we save them. And then we have this concept of fields. So in each case here, there is a field with a name. This is the name that gets persisted in our front matter. And then a widget. And there's a set of built-in widgets for Netlify CMS, like the string widget, the datetime widget, the text widget, the markdown widget, and the hidden widget. And when we look at this element, each of these fields is a widget control. And then over here, we have the preview output of the widget. And as I mentioned, you can very easily, since all of this is React, you can very easily just write your own widgets and say, like, I now want to create a Google Maps widget. You just specify control component for inputting a Google map and a preview component for rendering a Google map. And now this works out of the box. And we also have complex widgets like a list widget that can include like different widgets. We have an object widget, and you can combine that to have lists of objects. There's even a PR right now for like a matrix widget where you can specify a set of different kind of widgets that the user can add and so on. So you can build these really complex types. There's also a relational widget for when you need to create like relations between one collection and another. We have this concept of publish mode. So the simplest publish mode for Netlify CMS is just like when you save, it creates a commit to master and your new change go live. But we have this concept I mentioned of the editorial workflow. So in this case, if I go into this content manager and I decide to save this change we made, then I can go into my GitHub repository, and I'll see that now we have a new pull request from a content editor. And we'll see that there's like one file changed. The title changed from just in to hello Reactathon, right? Like full version control history and so on. And it's indistinguishable, like this is indistinguishable from a developer making this change, right? But what's actually a content editor? And now I can go in and look in my editorial workflow here, and I can see, okay, I have this draft. I I'm going to move it over and say it's ready for publishing. And then someone is going to come in and say, OK, let's publish these changes. And if we go back to GitHub, we see that, OK, the pull request has now been merged. And meanwhile, with a system like Netlify, you will see at every stage of this, Netlify picking up the changes and starting to run the build and publish the results. So this is the build of the initial pull request. It takes a little to run the optimized build. And this is the build of the actual master branch. Will be live in a few seconds. It has a media library as well. By default, you just specify a folder that it will upload media to, but we also have a concept of integrations. And we have, in private beta right now, we have an asset store that's one of the integrations, but the idea is that you can build integrations for uploading media directly to places like S3 or Cloud in-area or things like that, and use those systems. Another common integration is search, where by default there is an in-memory search of your content, but you can also hook in things like Algolia and use those for really large content sites. This is the CMS backend for Netlify's own website to give you some context of a more complex use case, and we use this for all of our content management internally. And that's about it. Thank you so much for listening. We have a very active community. We're closing in on about 100 contributors to the CMS, and it's by now the open source headless CMS with the most stars on GitHub. If you're interested in getting involved, we would love contributions. We try to build a really welcoming community also for people just getting started. So go join the community, hook up us with our team in Gitter, and hopefully this will be of use to a lot of you. Thank you.